Hello, and welcome to the Argyle AI Leadership Summit. My name is Vicki Lynn Brunskill with Argyle. It's great to have everyone joining us today. Just a couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speaker for the session. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during the event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and great overall experience today. At any time during the event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page. And now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Emily McReynolds, Head of Global AI Strategy at Adobe. We are so excited to have Emily with us for a thought leadership discussion titled Unlock the AI Advantage, Navigating AI Implementation. Welcome, Emily. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful. We're glad you're here. I know the audience is waiting, so let's dig right into this exciting and timely topic. Everybody's talking about AI. AI is such a hot topic. It's changing the way business is done. So I'd like to ask you, what are the primary considerations for an organization who's thinking of adopting generative AI?
I think one of the important things to think about right now, we've heard the hype, we've heard generative AI talked about for the last year and a half. So some people might think, oh, am I a little late getting started? And the reality is we're still thinking through what it looks like. And so recently I published a paper with Adobe talking through how do you get started, thinking about how do you evaluate your organizational readiness, looking at your technology governance, what people are doing inside your organization, understanding where AI is already being used. One of the things I've seen be really helpful is setting up an AI committee or council so that it includes people from across the organization. So I've seen councils set up based out of security, based out of privacy, based out of legal, but the most successful ones typically have a cross section of business leaders, of the CIO, the chief privacy officer, making sure that all the groups that make decisions in your company are really represented. I think a third thing is what are your current company values? So we talk a lot about, or you hear a lot about adopting AI responsibly. We don't want to slow down innovation. We want it to be the value and the proposition that increases the profit of your company. And at the same time, we don't want to end up on the front page. So what are your company values? How do you adopt technology generally? Do you have a responsible innovation policy? Is that something you think through? And if you don't, the paper we've released talks through AI governance and some of the principles that should be considered. I also like to remind people that even if you haven't addressed AI yet, or you think, oh my goodness, AI is it's this hyped thing, and I don't know how to approach it. The reality is, you probably have some form of data governance, some form of management structure for your technology, and in a way, this is just extending that to AI. So the fourth thing I'll really focus on is creating guidelines and thinking about how you're going to do your training. So a lot of companies spent a significant amount of time over the last year and a half figuring out how should AI be used in their organization. Some companies that were already building AI and might sound like, oh, we've been doing this for 10 years, they still had to figure out what it meant for employees to have access to these generative AI tools. So I think there's an aspect of this that is training your people. I've had conversations with companies that have bought a bunch of AI products and they say, oh, our people aren't using it, or they're doing things we don't want them to do with it. And that's not a mystery. It's kind of human nature to explore. And so really thinking about how do you set up guidelines for success for your employees. Similarly, we really need to think about who are you buying this technology from? So you probably already have some form of vendor management. It's common to ask about data provenance, like what kind of storage they're using, what kind of logic is in their systems. These are all questions that have examples in the paper we've shared. And I think one of the critical, and the last point I'll make, is having a human in the loop. This really you need to know where the human belongs. So typically, if you're talking about creating images, you would have some sort of review process, whether that's with your legal team or your compliance team. Um, but maybe in this case, you need the human in the loop earlier. Maybe you need to have a conversation about what questions, what inputs, what prompts we actually do with our AI, and what's okay to ask for and maybe what isn't okay to ask for. And thinking about, if we're creating more content than we have historically, what does that look like for our processes? So really thinking about these technologies as a tool that people use, I think is a great start on a path to success.
That's a brilliant point, right? Keeping the human in the loop. We're still going to be handling all the generative AI, as you said, prompts and that. So Adobe, I know, has conducted a lot of research on the topic of AI. Could you share some of those recent findings?
Absolutely. So late this summer, we did a research survey to see where organizations were at on their AI adoption journey, what kind of challenges they were facing, and what would be helpful to them in thinking about implementation at their company. So we did a survey that included over 200 people across 7 industries, and it also covered multiple regions. So I know this is a US focused conference. But we wanted to make sure for multinational companies, we thought about what does this look like in Asia? What does this look like in Europe and the Middle East? So most companies we found are still exploring and figuring out which tools to use, how to set it up in their company. It's why, even though it got exciting a year and a half ago, I still want to say, like, there are plenty of people who are figuring out where this fits. And even people who were early adopters, they might be figuring out, oh, well, this isn't the right technology for us. And so we need to think again about which ones we're going to use, because part of the reason we set up this framework that I talk about, it has 4 stages. Assess, thinking about your organizational readiness and how to responsibly buy these technologies and which ones you're going to do. Pilot, testing this out on like a few business cases or in a few different divisions. And then adoption, maybe you're buying it for a whole division, maybe you're buying it for a whole company. And lastly, monitoring. With AI, monitoring can be one of the most important pieces because we know that it learns. And so it can change over time. And so being aware of what metrics you're looking for and continually evaluating what that looks like. So these 4 stages really create the foundation for a resilient, successful AI strategy. And I think there were a lot of questions that came up. So we asked things like, what do you look for in choosing an AI technology? What are the major considerations? Things like being able to know what data was used to train the model, how the copyright was addressed in the data that was put into the model. What kinds of security standards do they have? How are they testing it? So these were all things that companies who had looked at adopting AI were thinking about and talking about. So that framework I described is really designed to meet organizations wherever they are on their journey. It's not intended to say like, oh, we've already bought AI, so we're good. One of the points my colleague Tony Van Winkle makes, and Tony is Adobe's head of digital experience for employees, is that you can have a technology that you've bought, but you might have different divisions across your company that are just in the assess situation. Or maybe, finance is piloting a particular technology. One of the most developed, maybe you have a coding assist that is just fully adopted and in use, but there are some other use cases that you want to explore. So even companies that have adopted it are still potentially looking at this framework and finding useful things within it.
Well, that's really interesting. Assess, pilot, adopt, and monitor. So that you talked about that as mentioned that the Adobe research led to development of that framework for a successful AI strategy. And of course, everyone was going to ask me to say, please do tell and dig in a little bit. Can you tell us more about the framework?
Of course. So this framework comes out of over 10 years of experience. And I think there's so many documents out there on how to build AI. If you're in the US, there's the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and they have an AI risk management framework. It's heavily focused on building, but it has good questions about buying. That said, it's over 80 pages long. So if you're coming to this fresh, like that's a lot to digest. Or there's the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a nonprofit organization that looks at AI legislation, AI adoption, and thinks about what the right thing to do in those areas is, particularly around data and privacy. And they put out a checklist for creating employee use guidance. There's, of course, if you're an international company, that we're looking at the EU Act. States in the US are taking that as an opportunity to have a model for what they want to do. Singapore has had a framework for over 5 years now that a lot of companies are involved with and thinking about. So I think it's really important to take a multicultural perspective and also be aware all these things exist. But the whole reason we wrote this framework was because it's a lot. I've spent 10 years keeping up with all of this stuff and following the developments and participating in different conversations. And so what I really wanted organizations to be able to get out of this framework is what are the straightforward things? Like, what do I do? Not the theory, here's where some challenges are, here's what you should think about, but like really like, okay, let's evaluate organizational readiness. What state is our technology governance in? How do we select responsibly built technology? That means what questions do we ask? And that's why you'll hear me regularly talking about, where's the data from? How is the model trained? Does that training, does our use of that technology go back to train the vendor's model? Is that okay with us? Is it not? So not just knowing what questions to ask, but what the answers are and why you're asking those questions. So that's a little more detail in like the assessment phase. I talked a little bit about pilot, but I think one of the key parts of having successful piloting that may be new because, right, we've as companies, we've had email systems for 25, 30 years. So there are things we just know. And if you're a company that is regularly buying new technology or not, there's some really interesting and important questions to ask, but you have to start with metrics. What are we measuring against? What problems are we trying to solve? One of the things we found most successful in Adobe's adoption of third-party vendor AI. So we, of course, drink our own champagne and think about, using our own tools. But one of the things we've wanted to share is how we were able to buy someone else's generative AI and implement it inside the company. One of the most successful things we did was working groups. So we didn't have a group say, okay, we know what's best for the company. We created a working group with volunteers and key decision makers from finance, from sales, from our central org that has legal and privacy and security in it. And having those people who are experts in their own space develop the metrics for their area, I think has been incredibly helpful. When we're thinking about adopting, we've spent a lot of time on training. So I have, a background across multiple companies, and I've done this kind of training for employees for a number of years now. And it's so critical, not because people can't go like learn how to write a prompt and get an image out, but because there's aspects of it of where does this fit in my work process? How am I thinking about the flow of my work? Because rightfully, people are going to say, well, that we have more time if we do it the way we've been doing it. This is like learning a whole new system. And so having that training in place and a rollout strategy really makes a difference. And then I've talked a little bit about vendor management, but after you've implemented it, that doesn't stop. You don't just ask questions when you get started. You want to make sure you're thinking about, have they changed anything? Am I doing annual check-ins? This kind of monitoring, what is our current risk level comfort? And figuring out where we might need to adjust, where we might need to evolve our practices.
All about adjusting and refining, right, at that point.
Yeah.
We have certainly covered a lot already, but a lot of ground on the topic of responsible AI, which is so important. Can you, summarize what you consider to be the best practices around AI governance?
Yeah, I think if we had to choose three things, we like numbered lists, we like knowing what we need to do, right? If we had to choose three things, I would think about where is my company at? Where is the most valuable use case? Because I think that grounds you in why you're doing this. It's so easy to be like, oh, it's new and exciting. I got to keep up with my competitors. But you don't want to be a year down the road and like feel like you wasted money on these technologies. So really thinking about where are we at? Where is it useful for us? Number two, in governance, you got to think about what kind of data, what kind of profile you're using, who in your company is going to be using this. So thinking about where it's going to be successful and how we measure that success. And then number three, really think about ongoing training. So in AI governance, we're making sure it doesn't go wrong. Nobody wants to end up on the front page of a newspaper. But how do you actually do that? Is really paying attention to how it's being rolled out. We're so used to email. There's like minor improvements here and there. We're so used to word processing programs. There's minor improvements and things and decisions to make there. But we're in a time when AI is making leaps and bounds month to month. And so really paying attention to what changes are happening and what that means for your organization would be my number three.
If you go on that topic for a long time. Thank you so much for what a wonderful discussion on this very, very important topic. But I do see that we have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience, and I want to go through those. The first question that came in is, what's the best process for navigating risk management?
Risk management is really about company comfort levels. So I've talked to companies that say we have a zero risk approach. We work with information that means we need the trust of our customers or our patients or our financial people. And so I think different organizations have different risk levels. And so knowing what yours is, what are the things that would be concerning so that we can mitigate those risks. There are risks in using a system that learns and that generates things. And so if you have a risk management structure, you have a starting point. If you don't have a risk management structure, with AI, really thinking about where it can go wrong in your systems, where it could go, sideways and create things you don't want it to create. But I think more importantly, like, what if it gives a wrong answer and that goes out, right? So having that risk management perspective in the first place, not treating it as this scary thing we can't do, but thinking about what are the real considerations for your organization and then addressing those. So at Adobe, we have privacy processes and security processes and data governance. And so that's how we manage risk. And that's how we make sure we're going above and beyond. Because for me, and I think a lot of organizations, risk management it isn't just about like the legal things you have to do or what the regulations tell you. You build your reputation over time doing the right thing, doing potentially more than the minimum. And so knowing where that might be damaged, where your reputation might be at risk, I think is really helpful. So having processes in place where you evaluate risk and decide what needs to be mitigated.
Excellent. Do you have any tips on that for someone who's just getting started, like in terms of, they don't really have the risk management in place and they need to get going? I figured that would be a good follow-up on that.
I think all organizations that are building something or selling something or providing services, they have a sense of where things can go wrong in their organization. And so basic risk management is like, where might something go wrong? How might that happen? What questions can we ask that will prevent, find, and then mitigate those issues? So that's how I would address it. Whether you're a small organization or a really large one, large ones typically have more risk management already set up. But it's really thinking about what could go wrong and what questions you need to ask to prevent that or detect it.
Perfect, thank you. All right, let me look. We have another question from the audience. It's, how do I know if my organization is ready to adopt AI solutions? That's a big one.
It's a big one. It's one I actually talk about a lot. I was just having this conversation yesterday with a colleague. How do we how do how do we answer, is my company ready? There's a lot of maturity assessments out there that will ask you questions about what processes you have in place, what governance you have, what are you using to build, sell your products or services. I think there are 5 areas that I would really look at. One is, who's involved in your technology decision making? Do you have a process for what it looks like to make those decisions as a company? Number 2 is, if you have those processes, like, what do they look like? Do they feel mature? Is everybody using them? Are people trying to avoid them? Do you need to do something differently with those? Um, Number 3 is like knowing how successful rollout of new technology looks at your company, right? And I have a tendency to do these kinds of things in questions you can ask yourself, right? Because I can make you a list. Oh, develop an AI council, set up pilots, create metrics, do training. But what does that actually look like is why I formulate these questions for someone to ask about their organization. So number 4, I will always, always, always bring up training, because it does your organization know how they want to roll these things out. Do you have a process in place? So if you have a process in place, if you're familiar with rolling out new technologies and training your organization, I think you're going to be setting yourself up for real success. And then the last one is having governance processes. How do you check on your systems going right? How do you do evaluations of the efficiency and the productivity of your workplace so that you will know if this is improving things for you?
Thanks. We have like 1 minute, and I want to see if you had any closing remarks before we wrap this up and send everyone on to the next session.
Thanks. I think the big point for me when I have these conversations is that this is all possible. There's no like, we can't do this, we're too late. There are so many options and opportunities in this space that if you haven't gotten started, get started. Start trying to figure out what makes sense for your organization. It's not too late, is the big thing I remind people. And there's lots of support out there. So companies like Adobe, if you're looking at one of those products, you're like, I don't know how this is going to fit in my organization, happy to talk to you about it. plenty of partners out there, consulting organizations that will help you figure out what you need to do. So there's a number of approaches, and I just like to emphasize it's not too late. There's so many opportunities right now.
I love ending on that note. Thank you so much for being here, and it's not too late, so we'll forget that. This
Thank you so
session,
much.
thank you so much. We're so glad that you were here. It's great you're going to hear from folks. This session, and everyone, you do have Emily's LinkedIn information on this session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Please click the join button that will appear at the bottom of your screen to be directed to that session, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again, Emily.
Thanks. Bye.